Gasp! An alert on my wacky watch at this hour? Oh no! Someone's venturing out into the void! They'll get totally spoiled!
Good morning, everyone. I hope your day is going well. Welcome to episode 2 of me analyzing Amazing Digital Circus characters. It's interesting to try and analyze a show directly after its finale comes out. In some ways, it's great because I get to hopefully ride the algorithm wave and have some interesting conversations about storytelling and execution. But on the other hand, it means that a lot of my analysis is based on my first impressions. And first impressions aren't the end-all, be-all. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the finale is slowly growing on me more and more as time goes on. And I've been trying to view the show more on its own merits and what it's trying to do, rather than my own expectations. And while I still broadly agree with everything I said in my original review, there's a few things I'm still trying to figure out. And one of them is the characterization of Gangle in the finale. In my original review, I said I was disappointed that we didn't get more of Gangle's perspective on Jax, because I thought it was really weird that we didn't get a moment of her actually talking about her feelings. Jax's death is clearly something that brings out a lot of really intense and complicated emotions, and I wanted to see that explored more. But after thinking about it some more, I started to wonder, is that really necessary for Gangle's arc to have a satisfying conclusion? She didn't get a lot of screen time in this episode specifically, but within the series as a whole, she's one of the only characters that has an episode entirely dedicated to them. She's had a lot of time to grow and change throughout the series, so did we really need to get more into it? Or was the implication of these complicated emotions enough as far as the writing is concerned? Was there actually a writing problem here, or did I just want to see more of Gangle's internal struggles because I find that interesting? Now, I want to be clear, I don't think there's a truly definitive answer to this question. I like to think I have a pretty good grasp of how to tell a story, but art is still subjective, and I fully expect some people to disagree with the conclusions I come to. But it's honestly really rewarding to try and figure out why you feel a certain way about a story, and I think it will be helpful in figuring out what this series was trying to do as a whole. So, in this video, I'll be taking a look at Gangle throughout the series, how she was introduced, what her arc was, and whether or not that arc was fulfilling in the context of the entire series. And by the end of this, I think we'll come to a better understanding of how we feel about the finale and Gangle in general. With all of that said, I think it's time we get started. Grab some water, a nice slice of cake, and get comfortable. Let's talk about Gangle. Identity and self-presentation are a really big part of Gangle's character, and this is obvious from the literal first moment that they're on screen. The adventure that they were apparently doing before Pomni showed up was recording a theme song, and each character is technically introducing themselves in this scene. They're making a choice about how they want to present themselves for the theoretical series that they're all part of. It's kind of meta, but you know what I mean. For most characters, this presentation remains intact for quite a while, because we don't really see these characters in depth for a while. Except for Gangle. The way that they're presenting is immediately subverted because of the mask breaking. They do not have the luxury of presenting themselves the way they want to. We immediately get to see what is underneath, and she doesn't get a choice in this. The very first thing we learn about Gangle is that she wears a mask, and secondarily, that mask is incredibly fragile. It's important to note that this mask is not presented as some sort of lie, but it is presented as something that can break very easily, and this is treated as very normal. Even though, if you think about it, this would be a little bit damaging psychologically. Everyone else is able to successfully mask their emotions whenever they feel like it, but you can't. And even when you can, people can tell you're doing it, and that, I think, would really mess with you. Like, imagine if your customer service voice could be broken off of you. Anyone at any moment could decide that you're not being authentic and just decide to see you at your most vulnerable. The mask is treated as a gag for a large part of the series, and it makes sense to an extent. They're in a cartoon world, but it's pretty messed up when you actually think about it. Gangle's mask is treated more as a belonging of hers than an aspect of her personality. It's rude to mess with it, but no one really makes a fuss when it gets broken because it feels like an inevitability. But I don't think it's entirely fair to blame the cast for acting this way, both because, again, they're in a cartoon world with cartoon rules, and because the comedy mask doesn't really act that different from Gangle. It's not treated as a big deal because the personality between the two of them is very similar. Gangle is a little more confident, a little more willing to ask questions, but she's still a very reserved and quiet character. The only difference is that she seems a little more content with it. I say that she seems more content because, as we know, she is wearing a mask, but I don't really see the mask as a lie or something fake that she puts on. It feels more like it's an aspect of her personality that just doesn't get to be front and center most of the time. She has some confidence, but it's easily broken down. And I think this tracks because even after Gangle's mask is broken time and time again, she is not a passive character. She still goes out of her way to participate and do things even when she is in a more vulnerable state. She expresses her thoughts and asks questions and has opinions regardless of whatever mask she is in. And I think that's an important part of understanding what the mask actually represents. I think the internet has a tendency to see masking as a unilaterally bad thing always, but it doesn't have to be. I'll get more into this later, but I think looking at Gangle's masks not just as something she's hiding behind, but a tool that she's using to try and become who she wants to be, is important for understanding what she's going through and what the narrative is trying to do with her character. Overall, at the start of the series, we have a reserved and sensitive character doing their best to be quote-unquote normal. But they're not able to mask effectively most of the time for reasons very much beyond their control. Which brings us to the central conflict that Gangle is struggling with throughout the show. You could say that the main issue that Gangle is having is that she's unable to stand up for herself, but that feels too simplistic for the Amazing Digital Circus, and it's really not reflective of what's actually going on. First of all, there's a lot working against Gangle trying to have an arc like that in the first place. The mechanics of the circus aren't really the main focus of the series, but it feels wrong not to mention that Gangle is not very physically strong, and doesn't really have a means of protecting herself against attacks, both emotional and physical. Most of those in the circus don't hold this against her, but one in particular does, and it's pretty bad. I'm not saying that Gangle couldn't have tried to stand up to Jax, but I don't think it would have gone very well, and Gangle didn't really have the support structure necessary to ever try to do this. So instead, her character arc takes a different form. Similar to Zooble, Gangle's main issue is that she thinks there's something wrong with her. For one reason or another, she can't seem to be what others want her to be. And when you're not sure about who you want to be, that's pretty hard. Even when you're trying your best and the people around you aren't trying to break your mask, they're aware that you're wearing one, and that's just not a good feeling. It's an issue of identity, how you want to present yourself and what you think you actually are versus what you're supposed to be. Gangle's whole gimmick is obviously intended as a metaphor for neurodivergence in some capacity. Well, I guess it's less metaphor and more that it's a physical manifestation of what masking is in real life, where you're doing your best to act completely normal and people seem to know that you're acting, even if they can't tell you why. Masking isn't a universally bad thing, but it can manifest in ways that are harmful, which is something that we see in the restaurant episode. The mask is never treated as something fake or as a lie that Gangle is telling, but it is shown to be something that doesn't bring out the best in her. This desperation for respect and normality results in Gangle being a little bit toxic and hard to be around. But it's complicated, because being your deepest, most vulnerable self all the time doesn't necessarily feel like you either. Human beings are complicated creatures, and there's often a lot of emphasis put on being your true self, even though most people have different ways of expressing themselves depending on who they're talking to. Yeah, maybe you're not 100% upfront with people all the time, but does that mean you're being manipulative when you hold the door open for someone, even if you're having a bad day? No, of course not. That would be insane. Identity is weird, and how you decide to present yourself is multifaceted and, once again, complicated. And it gets even more complicated when people look at you and tell you that you're not acting normal. And then you try to act normal, and people tell you that they like the other version of you better, and that really sucks. The bottom line is, Gangle has the desire to be viewed as normal, but what she's actually searching for is acceptance. She wants to feel comfortable expressing herself, she wants to have friends she can rely on, and she wants to be herself, even if at the start she doesn't know exactly what that is. And the real journey of her character that we see in the series is her trying to figure out exactly what she wants to be. This is kind of hard to do, though, because Gangle spends the first bit of the series in a really bad spot, because she arrived at the literal worst time possible. Gangle has it within her to be a confident and self-assured person, but she needs some help and support getting there. And absolutely no one was in the proper state of mind to do that for her when she first arrived. Ribbit had just died, so everyone was obviously grieving, but there are layers to the misfortune. Jax is in the midst of attempting to bury all of her human emotions and latches onto Gangle as a sort of new and interesting punching bag. Ragatha might normally have objected to this type of cruel treatment, but she had just finished promising that she wasn't going to mention the tap-dancing elephant in the room, and so she feels like she can't say anything without upsetting Jax again. Kaufmo is in a similar situation, having just been ridiculed for showing emotions by one of his closer friends, and Kinger's in the state of mind where he can barely tell where he is most of the time. Through no fault of her own, Gangle was placed in the circus in a very tense and strained time, when wounds were still fresh and no one could really be there for her in the way she needed. She didn't have any of the tools that might have helped her establish herself, and so she got stuck in various dynamics that were really detrimental for her. I can't even imagine how shocking and disorienting it must have been for her mask to break this first time. You have a brand new body you barely understand with a gimmick that makes you inherently emotionally vulnerable, and no one here seems interested in helping you understand what's happening because there's a whole ton of baggage that you have no control over and no way of knowing about. There is very little about this situation that would make it worse for Gangle. The only quote-unquote connection that Gangle gets is to Jax, and I don't think I need to explain that this was not a very healthy connection. The others probably weren't as supportive as they could have been, but Jax is a presence that actively stifles Gangle's progress in many ways. Jax is simultaneously projecting onto Gangle and punishing her for existing, and it really is just a terrible time for everyone involved. Gangle's progress towards confidence and self-acceptance is just impossible in this environment, because in many ways it's actively hostile. Zooble eventually arrives, but as we talked about in my previous video, because of their own emotional baggage, they weren't really there for Gangle at the start, and didn't start interfering until pretty late in the show. Gangle is stuck with a bunch of people who don't seem to understand or support her, even if some of them try to, and it's just really rough. But even if it took a while for her to find the support she needed, eventually she was able to have just one person there to support her. And sometimes having just one friend can really help. And Zooble is especially helpful because they get it in a way that not many other people could. Zooble and Gangle, in a way, have connected character arcs, where they both start out searching for a missing piece, but they end up realizing that they are complete and whole people who deserve respect and love just as they are. As I mentioned earlier, the way the circus members treat the mask is somewhat telling. They don't necessarily see it as something bad, but they also don't see it as something very important. The mask is going to break eventually, and no one has much of a reaction when it does in most cases. If it's broken on purpose, there's a reaction, but even in this case, Ragatha is more angry at Jax than concerned for Gangle. Jax has broken something of Gangle's. That's rude and inconsiderate, but the object that was broken is less important than the fact that Jax broke it. In some ways, this could be seen as good because they treat her the same regardless of the mask she's wearing, but mostly it just shows that the other circus members don't quite understand Gangle. This doesn't make them bad people, but it means that Zooble's support is unique and something that Gangle really needed. When Gangle asks Zooble to keep her comedy mask safe, this is the first time that the mask is being treated as something other than a problem. It's not treated as something fake or something that she's just hiding her true emotions with. This is a part of her that she wants to keep safe, because she doesn't think she can express herself authentically without it. And it's this specific interaction that I think gives us the most insight into how the masks work and how they're being treated within the narrative. I mentioned already that Gangle's masks are literally her masking, but I want to get a little more into it. We only have the opportunity to see her wear 2 different masks throughout the series, but the contrast between the 2 of them is interesting, and it says a lot about what the masks actually are. Gangle's comedy mask is a manifestation of her being more confident and assertive, and I think the reason that it's so fragile is because that's a part of Gangle that isn't very well developed. At the time of her brain scan, she has trouble being confident about anything. She feels like she's failed at achieving her dreams and is working a job that just makes her unhappy. She has inner strength, but that part of her hasn't been allowed to grow, so it's not able to withstand any sort of punishment. This doesn't mean that it's not real, far from it. I actually think that this is one of the most authentic parts of Gangle. And it manifests as a fragile mask because it's something that needs protecting. And in a way, it functions as a tool Gangle can use to feel more confident. Episode 6 is really where we see the culmination of Gangle's arc, and in it, we see that she doesn't need the mask to feel happy, but she uses it as a tool for courage. By keeping the mask intact, she's able to be herself completely and fully. It's able to help her get where she wants to be, but we see clearly by the end that she doesn't need this mask to feel happy and have fun. This mask functions more as something to aspire to. It's what she wants to be eventually, someone that's just a little more confident and a little less prone to tears. The mask is something worth protecting, but at a certain point, she's hoping that she won't need it anymore, because she'll be able to summon that confidence without the physical assistance. By contrast, the manager mask feels a lot more like a defense mechanism. I still think that it has roots in Gangle's actual personality, We can see in Untitled and the Beach episode that Gangle is very capable of being petty when she wants to, but it manifests in a much more overt and aggressive way. This isn't a pure expression of something that's already there, this is amplifying one part of your personality in an attempt to protect yourself. And I think this is part of the reason that the mask doesn't break so easily. There are parts of it that are rooted in reality, but it's largely a performance, an act. And this makes sense when we think about where exactly it came from. This isn't something that came with Gangle originally, this is something that Zooble gave her. I imagine that if this was taking place in real life, this would be the equivalent of Gangle having trouble managing her shift, so Zooble suggests that she pretend to be someone else for a day. And Gangle does that, and it does make her more assertive, but it also brings out some things that Gangle doesn't actually want to be. And we never see her wear it again after this. This might lead you to believe that the comedy mask is also a defense mechanism, because eventually Gangle stops wearing that one too, but they're not the same because Gangle stops wearing the comedy mask for an entirely different reason. It's not that it brought out something in her that she didn't like, it's more like she doesn't need it anymore. She's gotten to a point where she feels like she doesn't need it to be happy. In episode 6, They All Get Guns, Gangle and Zooble have a very meaningful conversation about themselves and how they feel about their circus bodies. And Zooble makes the assertion that they need to decide to love every part of themselves, just because it exists, and the only thing you should be focused on is being what you want to be. And after using the comedy mask in this moment of joy and catharsis, Gangle seems to take that idea to heart, because she almost never wears the mask again. In this moment, when the mask breaks, her joy is greater than it ever could have been with the mask on. And by making that choice to love herself, she doesn't need the tool of the mask to try and bolster her inner confidence anymore. The only time we see Gangle wear the comedy mask again is during Caine's tantrum, where we see it broken after an adventure. And this broken mask isn't even smiling, which the comedy mask usually is after being broken. It was probably a last resort to try and feel safe against Caine's onslaught, and it sadly didn't seem to be very effective. At every other point in the story, Gangle is making the choice to leave that mask behind. And I think this is a brilliantly subtle way to show that Gangle is growing and doing her best to be more authentic. The confidence is still in her, it always was, but now she's able to express it without the mask, and I think that's wonderful. The comedy mask and the restaurant mask represent two sides of masking as a concept. Masking can be helpful in a lot of ways, by helping you to get through your day-to-day and be more confident, but it can also make you act in ways that you never would normally, and potentially hurt the people around you in an attempt to keep yourself safe. And for Gangle specifically, the answer isn't to find the right mask, it's to stop masking altogether. Again, I want to reiterate that the comedy mask is not fake, and I don't see it as an evil thing, but it was being used to hide what Gangle perceived as imperfections. She saw herself as strange and abnormal, and she was doing her best to be something she thought others wanted. But that's not really a way to live. At some point, you have to decide to live for what you want to be. And in the end, Gangle no longer feels the need to use it. And I think that's an amazing progression for her character. She feels safe enough that she can be herself, and she feels confident enough that she doesn't need a mask to be who she wants to be. And in this specific way, Gangle's arc is really, really good. It shows both subtly and overtly that Gangle struggles with identity and who she wants to be, and she eventually reaches a point where she's living for herself and not anyone else. But where does this leave her when it comes to the larger narrative and her role in the finale? When you look at the entire series with the context of the finale, it becomes clear that nearly every character is dealing with identity issues in some way. We'll be going into this in more detail in the other character videos, but part of the reason that Pomni is able to function as a straight man is because she's one of the only characters who is somewhat self-actualized and sure of herself. After her initial speed bumps, she's able to function as a somewhat normal person in a place where everyone has very strange coping mechanisms relating to how they present themselves. This isn't the only thing that the show is trying to do or talk about, but it's a very important part of the writing. And this helps to contextualize Jax and Gangle and how their arcs interact. The two of them often act in similar and mirrored ways, which tells us something about both characters and makes some things more obvious than they would be otherwise. Gangle in the restaurant episode is mimicking Jax's behavior. Not in the sense that she saw what she was doing and went, oh yeah, that's a great idea, I'd love to do that, but more in the fact that both of them get through this by masking. They both have personas that they put on in order to protect themselves, it's just that Gangle's is a lot more literal. In some ways, it's very enjoyable to see Gangle able to stand up for herself for once, but the episode goes out of its way to show us that this very much isn't healthy for her. Masking can be a perfectly fine coping mechanism, but in this case, it's making the situation actively worse for everyone involved, Gangle most of all. And because the show is going out of its way to show how damaging this is for Gangle by having the masking be literal, we're able to more easily see when another character is doing the same thing. Jax masks her behavior all the time. The show gives us some visual indicators of this happening with Jax's pupil size, but it's really in the way that she acts that we can see this mask snapping into place. Situations where Jax is being emotionally honest are very few and far between, and they usually end with her backpedaling really hard. And we actually end up meeting these masks in the final episode, with each one showing a different way that Jax is trying to distance herself from the others. Where Gangle's masks are physical, Jax's masks are internal. And it would be a lot harder to spot if we didn't have these visual indicators or Gangle's example to reference back to. With Gangle, we can tell that some parts of this masking behavior aren't immediately unhealthy. It's important for her character that she eventually grows beyond these masks, but they're not immediately detrimental to everyone around her. With Jax, it's the opposite. Every mask she wears is specifically designed to drive people away. And I don't think I need to explain why that's a very bad thing. Gangle is showing us that masking isn't always bad. And because of that, we can tell as an audience that masking is only bad for Jax. This is actively hurting her and the people around her, and the only solution here is to drop the mask, which Jax is absolutely terrified of doing. Gangle is an important part of the story, not only because we get to see her character arc and growth, and that's interesting and engaging, but because she's an important part of contextualizing Jax's behavior, and she serves as an example of the good that can come from unmasking and actually trusting people with the parts of yourself that you worry they might not like. A big part of her arc is not worrying about what Jax or anyone else thinks and deciding to present herself authentically. That confidence that she has inside is no longer a mask. And it's really amazing to see all this happen. But in terms of the finale and Jax's eventual fate, there's a bit of a problem that I'll now finally get into. You're probably wondering why I just talked about Jax so much when this is the Gangle episode. And it's because these two arcs run kind of in parallel to each other. We learn a lot about Jax based on her behavior towards Gangle, but we also learn about Gangle based on how she reacts to this. Jax was not a good part of Gangle's life, but she was a very big part of it. Jax's presence was detrimental to Gangle's growth in a lot of ways, and her being able to break away from that fear is a big part of Gangle's growth. Her decision to team up with someone else and not worry about consequences and shoot at Jax a whole bunch is extremely important in showing that Jax does not have control over her anymore. She's standing up to Jax, which is something that she probably always wanted to do, but this is the first time she's been able to do it in the way that she wants to, without relying on a coping mechanism that makes her into someone she doesn't want to be. She's wearing a mask at first, yes, but we see that this glee at being able to fire a Tommy gun is genuine. This is Gangle being herself. And a big part of that is disregarding whatever possible things Jax might be hoping to do in retribution. Jax and Gangle aren't friends, but they are very important in characterizing each other in a way that I think is kind of unique for the series. Which is why I have a bit of a hard time with how little Gangle gets to talk about her feelings in the finale. Because as much as these two characterize each other, Gangle's exact feelings on Jax are something that we need to infer a lot of the time. We get some scenes of Gangle talking about Jax and how she feels about the treatment she has to endure, but that's often secondary in the conversation. Jax is used as a lead-in to talk about some of Gangle's deeper issues, and this is fine for most of the series, but once we get to the finale and Jax's death, it really feels like we should get some of her internal thoughts about this whole thing. Gangle is so often belittled and silenced and tossed aside by Jax, and so it feels very weird to me that with her gone, we don't get to actually hear Gangle express her deeper feelings about it. We get a few sentences, but it's not anything like the usual talks that we get from characters. And I find that bothers me a bit, because I really like Gangle, and I want to hear what she has to say about someone that she has every right to hate, but who was also a huge part of her life for so long. It's a complicated situation, and I want some insight into what she might be going through. But at the same time, if I step back and try and remove my feelings from the equation, I think the episode does do what it needs to. Jax was a big part of Gangle's life, and even though it was bad most of the time, someone like that leaves a hole when they're gone. And the episode takes the time to acknowledge this. There's a lot of complicated and conflicting emotions here. Gangle has a hard time feeling truly sad for Jax because of all that she was put through, but again, a huge part of your life is still gone, and you never want to feel happy that someone has died. And the episode makes sure to acknowledge that these feelings are there, and that she has the support to get through them. As much as I love Gangle as a character, I can understand from a technical standpoint that she is not the focus of the finale. The reveal of Jax's backstory and how that influenced her behavior and the circus as a whole is the primary focus, and in a lot of ways, those parts are really great. The narrative knew that it needed to acknowledge that Gangle was having some complicated feelings about this, and it does. And that leaves it open to talk about other things. In so many ways, the episode does everything it needs to end her arc in a satisfying way. You don't ever have unlimited time to tell your story, and even if you did, sometimes a story just flows better when you focus on one aspect of it. And in this specific instance, if I really think about it, I don't think the episode is doing anything wrong. You can argue that the choice to make Jax the big focus of the final episode was the wrong choice, but we can acknowledge that the narrative is making a choice here, and it's doing its best to tie up the loose ends without losing focus on where it wants us to be looking. I think it would have been a legitimate problem if the episode didn't do anything to mention how weird and strange this would be for Gangle, but the episode does mention it, in what is honestly a very sensitive and kind way. And from that perspective, I think the episode is fine. But I do still have my feelings. I very rarely analyze things from a purely detached, analytical perspective. And this is one aspect of the finale that I just have a hard time letting go of. I've been talking over and over again in this section about how much Jax affected Gangle's life, and I just can't shake off the thought that we should have gotten something from her perspective after Jax's death. And I'm really not talking about a lot here. What I would have liked is maybe 2 extra sentences, where Zooble walks in and asks if there are complicated feelings, and Gangle says yes, and then she says that things were really bad most of the time, but she's going to miss Jax, and then she asks if something is wrong with her. And then Zooble responds that no, there's nothing wrong with her, and that grief is complicated. And then Gangle surprise hugs them, and we get a nice mirror of that earlier moment where Gangle was hugged by Zooble, and then we get the "we're still human" line, and all is well. I know this is a very small change, but I really just want Gangle to actually get to talk about her feelings with someone in a way that isn't quite so vague. But then again, maybe the fact that this change is so small means that it truly isn't necessary. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe the point is that we don't know exactly what Gangle is feeling. Gangle spends so much of this series being a character that literally cannot hide how she feels. She does not have the option of putting on a brave face, both literally and figuratively. She cannot hide when she is sad. And so maybe the point in this moment is that we as the audience, for the first time, don't get to know exactly how she's feeling in the moment. I've seen a lot of different interpretations of this scene, where some people think she's running away in anger, and others think sadness, and others say that she's trying to hide that these are tears of joy or something, and maybe that ambiguity is entirely intentional. I would have liked to know how Gangle is feeling in this moment, but I think as far as the series goes, there's nothing really wrong with the way that it was done. And it's perfectly fine for me to think that a series could have done something different while acknowledging that there's technically nothing wrong with it. Everyone is going to have their own opinions on art and storytelling and interpretation of a narrative, and that's really the beauty of it. And it's part of the reason that I enjoy doing analysis like this. Overall, I think Gangle's arc is wonderful and very well executed. We get to see her grow so much and start to feel safe in expressing herself. And in that regard, the series does a great job of making her ending feel wonderful and satisfying. And in terms of how she feels about Jax dying, maybe that's something that the show can just be a little more ambiguous about. Gangle is a wonderful character, and I'm very, very glad that we were able to get to know her as the series went on. There are maybe some small things that I think could have been executed better in terms of backstory and how things were portrayed, but honestly, I'm just really happy that we got to see her grow in the way that she did, and that she got to have her happy ending with the person that she loves, surrounded by those who are supporting her creative endeavors. The Amazing Digital Circus is not perfect, and I think I'm gonna keep running into that fact through the entirety of this analysis series, but I don't ever want my critiques to overshadow the genuinely amazing things that this series has to offer. And I hope that as we continue, we can talk about our hang-ups while still acknowledging the amazing work of art that this show is. And thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Gangle is one of my favorite characters, and I'm really happy that I got to do a video focusing on her. Just as a reminder, this is part of an ongoing series where I talk about all the major characters in the Amazing Digital Circus, so if you don't want to miss anything, please be sure to subscribe. And feel free to check out the playlist if you want to see the characters that I've already talked about. I usually do an after-party stream on Twitch after a video releases, where I play chill games and talk about the video, but I'm going to be a lot busier this month than I thought I'd be, so instead I'm going to encourage you to check out my VODs channel and follow the Twitch page so you can be notified when I go live. And if you're so generous that you'd like to support me monetarily, I have a Patreon, where you can get exclusive updates, early access to videos, and so much more. And I'd like to take a moment to give a special thank you to all of my patrons, including, but not limited to, Perplexia Sphinx, Snick, Tree, Lurch18489, Sphinx, I May Be Dumb, and Puppet Wraith. Thank you all once again for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I hope to see you all again soon.